applies that this is my personal view. It's not a view of the fund, IMF or the management. So what do we want to discuss today? What I want to discuss today is the COVID policies that really stood out. One of the government interventions that really stood out during COVID-19, which is the credit programs. So as we know that in 2020, the governments around the world deployed a flurry of measures encompassing fiscal, monetary, macro, all hands on deck kind of a moment at unprecedented scale and speed. The program or the fiscal intervention that I'm particularly interested in this paper is what I like to call credit guarantee programs or credit programs. It was really used heavily by advanced economies. As you see in this chart, which is coming from the IMF database that has a survey of each desk, a real-time stock taking of what kind of interventions are being taken place. We see that advanced economies made available about $5 trillion in several months, just about several months at the beginning of COVID, which is about 10% of GDP on average, as it highlighted in the yellow bar here. What we're separating here is quite interesting. The dark blue bar is what we call the additional spending and foregone revenue. This is a traditional fiscal measures like tax deferrals, wage subsidies, cash transfers, etc. The lighter blue is what is really interesting. What we call what includes equity injections, government loans, and credit guarantees that are introduced by governments. What's interesting here is that on average, the size is actually almost the same, almost equal as the traditional fiscal measures that we know. And in some countries like Italy or Germany or Japan, these use of these credit measures were much higher than even the traditional measures. So the natural question follows is what is the macroeconomic impact and what is the implications of these fiscal measures that we don't know about, we don't know very much about. And then the question comes that the question suddenly becomes a measurement issue because we know very well how to measure the fiscal cost of tax cuts or government spending, etc., in the usual budget, in the budget accounting. However, we don't know how exactly to compare that to a credit programs. Let's say a government introduces a credit guarantee for 5 years to certain firms with certain maturity, etc. How do you compare these apples to apples? So that really, before we get to the big question of what is the macro impact of this government intervention, the question has to start from how do we measure it? And this is a big challenge. And then we were very surprised that this was a challenge because we see across countries that there is no uniform way of recording these government interventions in their budgets. Some countries like to mention it as just one-off item, and some just mention it as some kind of a below-the-line item. It doesn't even have a fiscal cost attached to it, no matter what the size of the announced package was. So what we're trying to do in this paper is really simple. Try to compare these fiscal interventions, these credit programs, and be able to make a comparison, apple-to-apple comparison with other kind of traditional fiscal measures that we know of. And the concept that we're using is a subsidy component or subsidy element, which uses a fair value approach that I'll get to in a couple of slides. So that's really how we're going to that is really the exercise of really estimating the subsidy components. The focus again is about credit guarantees. We're not focusing on government equity injections or forbearance schemes. The companion paper that we have with Debbie, we looked into all these other measures, forbearance, macro, regulatory forbearance, etc. But this paper, we focus solely on the credit guarantees, which in many countries was the bulk of the credit programs. The empirical analysis covers 7 large advanced economies, which includes 5 large advanced economies in Europe, plus Japan and the US. Although this is just these are just 7 countries in dollar terms, the amount of credit available by these countries accounted for more than 90% of the total credit programs, credit guarantees that were announced in 2020. So there is some macro significance there. And another factoid is that developing countries like Mexico or Brazil, they use relatively less on credit policies than advanced economies. I'd be curious to know why there was a policy choice, but that's for a different discussion. The data we have, we really kind of go through each credit programs, and then we have in the paper, there's an annex that mentions in detail the credit condition, the descriptions of these programs. What we're doing is that we take it from official sources, we cross-check with IMF country desk in charge of these countries, who also check with country authorities, and also there's a very nice paper by Vogel focusing on European countries. That how credit guarantee programs were designed for European countries. So we combine these pieces of information together. The key takeaway is that we saw that even within countries, but also across countries, these credit guarantee terms varied widely across programs, and it really depended on the objectives of these programs. For some countries, actually, in many countries, the main target of these programs were SMEs. Because if you remember in 2020, we were very worried that SMEs will have a liquidity shock and also may have to exit even if they're solvent. So they're really a focus on SMEs. For other there are programs that have that targeted larger companies, like airline companies, for instance, but their guaranteed terms were much less generous than the ones for SMEs. Strikingly enough, in many countries, we also find guarantees that are 100% guaranteed by governments, meaning that there's no risk, no skin in the game by banks, and also they relaxed the screening process by the bank, so it was mostly automatic approval. If firms just go to the banks, the loans were dispersed, which were also kind of problematic, and we can talk about that in terms of governance and design, etc. So that's the first point. The second point is that the take-up was much smaller. Actual take-up was much smaller than the announced envelope. So the announced envelope is the first chart I showed you with these bars. These are purely announced, the size of the credit programs for that was announced, which registered about 5 trillion USD. The take-up was about a third of that. And there's a sizable cross-country differences in terms of the subsidy component that I'll get to in a couple of slides. And in European countries, for those who are used to this European Commission framework, they apply the same kind of framework. There's a broad, consistent framework that governments were subject to, which is called a temporary framework that has some kind of terms on guaranteed terms, interest rates, etc. Even among EU countries, there was a big difference across subsidy component. And then this is quite interesting. So more subsidy means it's the more costly for the government. On average, for all the programs that we evaluate, the average subsidy element is about 67% of principal. And if we exclude US PPP, that goes down to 37% of 37%, meaning that PPP was really more like it's more like a grant rather than an actual guarantee program. And there's a wide range ranging from 12%, the subsidy element ranges from 12% to 100%. What we find interesting is that the take-up is not necessarily correlated with subsidy elements. So the generosity of the interventions were not not the main driver of the take-up, meaning that there are also other factors. And looking back, we see that these credit guarantee programs had low fiscal costs because there were vaccines, etc., that really removed the tail risk of a permanent recession. But then initially, at the initial level, there is an adverse, it could be a fiscal, it could have adversely affect long-term sustainability.
So you have 10 minutes.
Yeah. So yeah, let me quickly go over this. Yeah, so like just to get to the subsidy element of the idea, how we understand that is really a question of what is the correct cost of capital for governments. There's a notion that the government activities are risk-free by definition, and then they should use the borrowing rates, risk-free borrowing rates, to discount their costs. However, if you really think about it, we are arguing that this is not the case. So if you think, so I'm just putting a very simple balance sheet here. If governments engage in risky loans with a return of, let's say, RA, and then they can be financed by government debt and equity. The government debt part is the risk-free part, which is unrelated to the risk of the investment itself. What is really being assumed here is that if these risky loans make a loss, then there's an implicit assumption that taxpayers will cover for that. There's a backstop by taxpayers. What it means is that if these risky loans incur losses, it will be for the taxpayers to pick up the check, and then they'll be incurred by, they will be the ones who will be paying for it. That's something that is unique in the government balance sheet setup. Meaning that this taxpayer is really like equity holders. And if you go back to this Modigliani-Miller kind of idea, then the cost of capital for governments should be the weighted average of this debt, the risk rate related to the debt and rate related to taxpayers, because they are also taking risks. So that's the point that we're trying to make here, that we cannot use the borrowing cost. But a lot of countries, they use cost of capital. They equate cost of capital as a borrowing of the bond deals necessarily, and then this is it's problematic, because if you use a lower rate with a risk-free rate, the government systematically understate their cost of capital, and then because they don't take any these rates obviously by definition don't have any credit risk, etc. And then what it does is that, and I get a little bit technical in terms of accounting, if governments adopt cash accounting, what happens with credit guarantees is that initially the governments actually receive guarantee fees. And if you record that as an income, it makes it look like government is making money. It's a revenue for the government, which is really not the case. So there's a lot of kind of details on the paper. With a given time, I'll try to I'll refer the audience to the paper. So what we're arguing here is that you should really use the market rate, which is what we call a fair value rate. A fair value rate is something that may not be observable, and that's what makes this exercise very difficult, because you cannot go to a market and then take a number. Conceptually, though, a fair value rate is what these private banks would have lent to these firms, the rate at which that private banks would have lent if there were no government guarantees. So that is the concept that we're going after. So let me, perhaps I could spend 1 or 2 minutes here. Yeah, so I think it's easier to give an example of what I'm trying to do. Let's assume that there is a credit guarantee, the 100% government guarantee for 2 years, and the loan amount by the firm was 100,000 euro, and the annual interest rate is a concessional rate at 3% of 3%. And there's a grace period that the first year there's no principal, no interest payment, etc. And the loan duration is 2 years. Very simple setup. So basically, what I'm trying to do is that at T+1, there's no kind of cash flows, outflows from any of the participants. So at time 0, the lender, the bank, lends 100,000 euro to borrowers. And then at time T equals 0, because of the grace period, there's no income, there's no cash flow. At time T+2, lender will have to receive interest rates, compounded interest rates to the principal. The borrower will have to pay this amount, PMT2. And because it's 100% guarantee, the government will have to pick up the rest, whatever is remaining of the payments. So what is a subsidy element in this, what is a subsidy element of this loan, this guarantee, is that it's really, you have to look at what it would be the fair value rate, what the lender would have charged charged firms if there were no guarantees. So let's assume that for the sake of argument that this is 7%, that if they would have charged with the credit risk, etc. Then the principal, if the present value of that the loan becomes much lower than actually $100,000, and the difference of that would be the subsidy element, how much the government guarantee is making that loan cheaper. So I know I'm going to go a little bit faster here.
Still have 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So having that subsidy element in mind, conceptually, that we're going to really apply that to the programs that we examine here. This is a list of programs that we look into, except some corporate bond purchasing by the UK, etc. So there are some common features of these credit guarantee schemes that we're seeing, that this is a tiering of government guarantees, with SMEs being the highest, and there's a last point is that added generosity. Some governments introduce pre-amortization or guarantee fees are waived, but these are more kind of interesting features that we make note in the paper. First, I'd like to talk about the take-up. How much was actual take-up of these credit guarantee programs? The average take-up as a percent of the envelope was about 42%. Which is really relatively high. This would be considered a successful credit guarantee programs. But the take-up varied a lot, and I think this would be very interesting to understand what drove this take-up variation. So Spain and US, there was a very large take-up as opposed to the envelope, which is a dark red bar, where the Germany was only 7%. To give you some kind of idea, a hypothesis, Spain didn't have much other kind of fiscal interventions aside from credit guarantee programs that allowed firms to use this more extensively, where for Germany, there was this Kurzarbeit, which is a wage subsidy scheme, which supported a lot of balance sheets for firms already. So this is one hypothesis why the take-up varied a lot across countries, but this needs further research to understand this. This is just showing the subsidy element ranging from 0 to 100, with 100 being the most generous and 0 being no subsidy. We're for the programs that we evaluate. So we have categorized these programs in red when there were full guarantees, 100% guarantees, and blue, which is a partial guarantee. So there's some risk taking by banks, but these are more for medium-sized SME firms. And the yellows are the ones that are partial guarantee, but for larger firms. And you actually have this kind of nice pattern where you see that the most generous were this top right corner, reaching as much as 100%, whereas Spain, for large companies, it was the subsidy element was only 12%. So there's a big wide variation. If we compile that these programs into aggregate that at the country level, we get to this calculation where the average subsidy element on average across countries is about 67%. And if we exclude PPT, which is almost like a grant, it gets to 37%. And you have this very large variation ranging from about 0.5 to 4% of GDP and the subsidy cost for each country. Finally, I like to show this scatter plot that with just eyeballing, there's no correlation here. The point I'm trying to get is that the subsidy element and which is the generosity of a program and the take-up, there's really no correlation that we could find. Fair enough, we only have 17 observations, so it's very difficult to run any regressions or find any kind of a meaningful correlation here. But just based on these observations, we see that there's a lot of different. Subsidy element was not the only factor that explains the take-up. So this is really my last slide. So in this paper, we just try to make this estimate the fiscal cost of credit guarantee programs for a wide range of countries to put a price tag on these programs. And the concern for us is that there's a lot of governance issues. There's not a uniform way how governments should record this, and that is a concern because there's no upfront recognition of this fiscal, very big, large, potentially very big interventions by governments. And also we think that there will be an over-reliance of government credit programs first, because there's no, if you don't explicitly account for it, you don't recognize the cost. And also public debt is so high that there are more governments that will be more willing to take advantage of credit guarantee programs rather than having above the line measures, etc. So this is a paper, and then
right. Thank you, Santiago and Daniel, for inviting me to discuss this paper. It was super interesting. I first give my view on what this paper is about, and then I make two general points on what I thought about it. So you showed convincingly that during COVID-19, but actually also before, for example, the European debt crisis, we have created multilateral financial institutions that relied a lot on credit guarantees and loan programs. And potentially they create significant economic benefits. But if you wanted to do a true cost-benefit analysis, we must also talk about the costs. And so far, what governments are doing in official statistics is a bit opaque. There are different standards that are applied. And what is the key challenge here? So the key challenge, as you pointed out, is that these liabilities are contingent. So we don't really know how they will evolve in the future. So given that we don't have a common standard to evaluate these risks, we also lack, to some extent, an efficient evaluation of the use of tax revenues. You mentioned that the taxpayer can be seen as an equity holder of government debt and of these guarantees. So there's risk that is assumed by taxpayers, and an efficient use and accountability requires that we have a transparent understanding of the cost of these programs. And then you use a fair value approach, and in the next slide, I give you my take on the fair value approach to estimate the upfront cost. So we're talking here about the upfront cost, not the ex post realization. They're about 3% for the US in terms of GDP, and in Europe, they vary quite a lot depending on the take-up rate as well, which is low in Germany and higher in Spain. But importantly, because you're measuring the upfront cost, is if we now look at that these programs didn't cost that much in the end because we didn't have many defaults of the firms that are supported, it might understate the true cost upfront, which also should capture that the economy could have gotten a lot worse without the development and of vaccines and other positive factors that have played a role. Okay, so what is the fair value methodology? So for me, the key ideas goes back to the eroded root state pricing framework. So market prices should mirror the cost and risk that are inherent in the economy. So how do you do this in practice? You take two ingredients. There's no secret sauce. You just use program information as much as available. I should point out that in practice, if you want to do this upfront in real time, it might not be there. So it's difficult to judge this in real time. And then you apply contemporaneous market data on interest rate and credit spreads to the extent available to calculate the subsidy rate. So the key challenge is that these future flows are uncertain. So in financial economics, we would calculate a net present value. And given that we deal with future cash flows, we must think about discounting. Typically, what is done also in the press when policy makers or politicians talk about whether such a program was profitable, then they often mention that they've earned billions by lending out because they were repaid, didn't cost much. But this is sort of the accounting profit, whereas what we should be interested in is the economic profit, which requires a compensation for the risks that are assumed by the government implicitly. So then what you're doing is you use a set of judgment-based assumptions to calculate the subsidy rate. And then you can calculate the difference between the implicit market rate and come out from the private sector and the effective loan rate. Scale this up by take-up and you have the cost. Sounds relatively easy, but there are a couple of difficulties in practice. But what is great about this methodology, speaking with my European Commission head, is that it's really easily applicable across different countries. So you can apply it to different programs that are different in nature, also in different countries, and you can get a cross-country comparison. Just to give you a brief view on the credit guarantee accounting in the EU. So first of all, we have this policy tool is actually quite widely used. So here I show the stock of guarantees in percent of GDP for the 4 countries that are in the euro area, for example. And you see a huge increase in all the countries for the stock of guarantees from 2019 to 2020, especially in Spain, but also in Italy. But then if you dig deeper and you really look how these things are accounted for, then there's quite strong cross-country differences. So either they're counted as one-off guarantees, which basically means that they're only considered as costs when there is a default. So only on realized losses on a cash basis. And that seems to be the practice in Germany, Spain, and France. They're considered one-off. Whereas Italy seems to be the country where they're really trying to use an accrual-based measure, which we call in Europe standardized guarantees. So the budgetary impact is judged by the future expected calls. I haven't said much about discounting, and I actually didn't figure out what discounting is used. In the official manuals, it's a bit unclear what is used in practice. I would think that probably the government borrowing rate is used in practice, but I would need to check that. Maybe for your next project, it could be interesting to look in the energy crisis support. Thank you. Because, so I show here, while I took the screenshot, there was a hand here. Okay. But the one I want you to focus on is this one. So we have here the average granted state aid framework in Europe, and that's around 1% of GDP on an average year. In COVID-19, it increased by quite a lot. But what we see now in the energy crisis in Europe, this is increasing even further. Okay, to be fair, I'm plotting here the approved state aid, not the granted one, so that might be a difference. But this seems to be still the tool of choice. Maybe because we are not really understanding the costs yet, or maybe it has been very successful. But this is quite relevant, this topic, and it continues to be relevant. So it's not an exceptional COVID-specific treatment. And then if we dig deeper into what is the state aid actually doing, so I don't expect you to read now all these blurry lines, but bottom line is that there's a lot of reliance on credit support programs, actually more than sort of direct price support as we might think if we just look at the news. Yeah, and these data are freely available. So for your maybe next project, you can have a look there. Okay, then I'm coming from a macro perspective, general equilibrium modeling. So what I find fascinating about the fair value approach is that it integrates economic theory into an accounting approach. But how far should we really take this marriage of the two disciplines? So for example, you're borrowing from private sector accounting, but government action is different in the sense that it might have general equilibrium effects. So it can have broader macroeconomic implications. And actually these should affect the states of nature and their realization probabilities. So do these assumed rates that we have to take from somewhere to calculate the subsidy rate really account for the general equilibrium effects of these programs, which can be, for example, relaxing borrowing constraint, making incomplete markets more complete, can be easing market frictions. Okay, this is maybe the last resort for policymakers to generating confidence in facts, but it can be also general equilibrium effect. So if there are these general equilibrium effects, and provided they are mirrored in the market rate, which is not clear, then it also really matters at what point in time we take the market rates in order to measure the upfront costs. But that's quite a critical step. At the same time, you also mentioned in the paper that you want to avoid using reference rates during times of distress when there might be problems with market liquidity. But I think it's really important to get also a view on this macro assessment, even though in practice it might be super difficult to get a view on the broader macroeconomic implications, but they are also mattering for the upfront cost estimates. And then at the same time, they might also interact with other programs. So a successful wage subsidy program, short-term work programs, they might alleviate the needs for these programs in general. I have a couple of practical aspects. So should we estimate these take-up rates upfront? Because what the paper is doing is using the features of the program and then use the realized take-up rates. But shouldn't the take-up rates be also sort of upfront estimated, even though that's difficult, but just from a conceptual point of view? Because otherwise they might reflect a different state of nature that has realized later on when the take-up is actually decided. And from a European perspective, it would be good to cross-check the assumed fees that are in the model, because in the EU, the credit support was often conditioned on these fees in order to be allowed as a form of state aid in the European framework. Then more generally, is there a strategy to deal with incoming information or revisions? How should we update these costs more conceptually? And then, okay, here you use the market rates as sort of an expected value, but one could also apply different tools, I don't know, option pricing tools, you probably know better than me, where we could think about the distribution of risks or some tail risks that we could infer also from market data. There's also, what I like about the paper is there's sensitivity analysis on the parameter uncertainty. For example, the loan maturities and loan rates that are assumed. Could be good to maybe also see whether we can have some information on joint distributions of these parameters to get a broader understanding. Not sure if that's possible.
Great. Got 1 minute.
Perfect. Then I use this minute to sum up. So I really like the paper. It shifted really my understanding of how we measure these credit costs. I'll be more cautious when I hear that a program brought profits to the government. What I like about it as well, it stimulates best practice development because there are a bunch of practical examples. And I think that's what we really need to do, because if we want to really unskew the cost of these programs, we must have a bunch of debates of how to do this really in practice, because there's considerable degree of art still involved. But we shouldn't shy away from these debates, I think. And yeah, for me as a general equilibrium modeler, found it interesting to think about whether we could incorporate aspects of general equilibrium there. And then you mentioned this also in your presentation, so I don't want to stress it too much, but there's a missing correlation between the headline generosity. So, we have unlimited provisions of credit support, and then the take-up is very small, and it would be really interesting to dig deeper what's driving this. Thank you very much. Papers, we want to get a really broad, comprehensive understanding of different drivers of inflation and growth in the euro area and the US. Try to understand similarities and differences. The study will be quite broad brush, so we're not going into specific channels, but the idea is to have a model that can capture a lot of different channels, and then we can see in the specific literature what we can learn from the larger model, where should we focus on maybe digging deeper. What we do is we estimate a 3-region DSG model, so all these aspects are modeled jointly, which facilitates and also the cross-country comparison between the cross-region comparison between the euro area. What I will show you as sort of the main result are shock decomposition. So which shocks are driving GDP and inflation dynamics in the 2 regions. And it allows us to jointly evaluate competing hypotheses that are out there. So just mentioning demand, supply, fiscal versus monetary, domestic versus foreign, labor versus product market. The idea is not to give the ultimate answer to these questions, but just to sort of join in the debate and inform to the perspective of a quite comprehensive, but yet standard workhouse model, which I guess many colleagues here in this conference are still using. However, we need to cut a few corners, implement a few tricks to be able to estimate these models over the pandemic period, which is characterized by extraordinary volatility, which is hard to measure in a standard ECFIN. Just to give you some main results as a preview. So in terms of economic activity in 2020, and I have to say that this paper was sort of a race against crises that are materializing. So we started off looking at GDP dynamics and consumption dynamics mostly in 2020-21. Then inflation picked up. We enriched the model to also have a better role of commodities and energy prices. So we extended the model from a more pure COVID 2020-21 perspective to also include 2022, where there's more inflation driven by commodity prices. So the first point is that what we are finding is that forced savings led to a consumption-driven recession in both regions, and the recovery was mostly driven by the removal of those frictions. And we find a stronger role for this in the euro area compared to the US. So maybe it's the earlier availability of vaccines in the US, or generally less stringency in lockdowns. Then compared to this, the 2021-22 inflation surge was partially recovering demand in both regions and also increased commodity prices. Fiscal expansion in our standard model, and I have a different robustness check that I probably don't have time to show today, is exerted a sustained and positive influence on inflation, and that's without having any debt sustainability concerns in the model. And comparing the two regions, we find that in the euro area, there's a much stronger role for supply side driven inflation compared to the US, which seems to be in line with the common conventional wisdom. And it's good to see that the model can replicate these findings from other studies. I want to spend a few minutes on getting the facts right. So we see here in 2020 a huge decline in GDP per capita in both regions, but it was a deeper drop in the euro area, and the recovery was slower in the euro area. Inflation picked up a bit later in the euro area, but then it exceeded the one in the US. What is particularly notable is private consumption. Here I show annual data, but it's even more striking in quarterly data, how large the drop in private consumption was in Europe and how slow the recovery is compared to the US in terms of private consumption, and a similar picture for private investment. Then in terms of headline government budget balance, the US, well known with these large-scale transfer programs running a massive deficit, much larger than the euro area, despite stronger automatic stabilizer. Policy rate, there was a bit of scope for lowering the policy rate in the US compared to the euro area. So our model will also have to capture this. And what is also striking is the difference between hours and employment, so intensive and extensive margin between the regions. So hours worked fell in both regions, but in Europe or in euro area, employment didn't really move that much, whereas in the US you had a strong decline in employment. That's even more dramatic in quarterly data. So the model will have to get these facts right, and now I will show you what we're doing. Just for placing our paper in the literature, we are in this first camp here. We use multi-country models for comparing different economies. What we are not really doing is we are going not the road of these mergers of epidemiological and macro models, something we also play with, but for this project we didn't include this. We also maintain the assumptions of a one sector economy. I think if I were to extend that paper, that would be maybe the first direction, to add another sector to really get these different sectoral dynamics right. But what we do instead is more, and here we are placed, we extend the standard model in a rather parsimonious way, which maybe is also from a methodological point of view interesting for others still relying on these models for policy work. Okay, so what we're doing, we're using an estimated workforce DGE model, trying to keep it standard because our interpretation of these shock decompositions and which are the drivers of inflation and growth dynamic also hinges upon the understanding that this model is sort of an estimated workforce model that we are familiar with and we can understand in different ways. We have three regions. They are linked by trade flows in final goods and commodities, and they're also linked via financial markets. So in the US and euro area, they are isomorphic blocks in our model. They're the same, quite detailed blocks. We have two types of households, so no Henk yet, but a Henk model, different firms and monetary and fiscal authorities. The rest of the world block, where also the Banco de Mexico is operating in, is a bit streamlined. That's mainly not reflecting our interest at all. This is more reflecting the data availability. So we bunch here a big couple of countries together into a rest of the world here. And the US and the rest of the world, they are commodity exporters, but the US remains a net commodity importer and the rest a net consumer. We have the usual bells and whistles that are typical in this literature to match a wide range of time series. And what is maybe new is the inclusion of a couple of salient pandemic features such as forced savings and labor hoarding, so short-term work schemes especially. Yeah. It's a bit of a nasty utility function, but I still want to show this one point, what we're doing here. That you see that we cut some corners, but I will show you that this might be a sensible way to do it. So you consider a standard Ricardian household that maximize utility, ignore these brown terms for a moment. So we have utility subject to habit formation. And then what we add is a temporary shock to the marginal utility of consumption. That sort of brings down the value of consumption one period. Think about a lockdown, risks associated or limited consumption opportunities. And then it pushes back without entering habit formation in the next period already. And this is a quite useful shock to be able to match a 20% drop in quarterly consumption in the euro area. So that's a very parsimonious way to get these consumption dynamics right. If you just had a discount factor shock, it would be quite hard to get the model right with data. So that's why we introduced this parsimonious shock. We also have these hand-to-mouth households. These guys are also facing curtailed spending opportunities and accumulate savings that are then repaid over time. We played around with different, more complicated processes here. So here, for this paper, we used the simplest possible. We did after 2 years, there's a gradual decline of the actual savings that were accumulated. I think one could do better by having a model using an OLG framework or something, but
I was curious, sorry, Robert, I was curious, why is that a decrease in the marginal utility of consumption? It seems like an increase, no? You consume less, your consumption doesn't go as far, so you need to consume more.
Yeah, sorry, then I just had a slip in what I said. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, you're right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, and can I ask?
Yeah, sure.
It's like on standard yourself. Do they know there's a process on those epsilons? And if so,
Yes.
does that increase or decrease precautionary savings?
Yeah, I will show you the impulse response functions in the next slide. That
Okay.
should be there. But so the realization here is a shock,
Yeah.
a white noise shock. But then once it happened, the process is known.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess I was just wondering, like, for thinking about consumption savings problems,
Yeah.
knowing that there's risk on that term.
Yeah.
Do I save against it, or do I?
No, this comes as
I might want to save tomorrow.
This comes as a complete surprise in this linear model here. There's no precautionary savings. Yeah. Okay, the IRF will come up. I just spent a minute on this multi-stage production framework just to give you a flavor of what kind of elements are included in this model. So we have the final goods production, which can be used for government consumption, government investment, private investment, and so on. And they are composed of imports from the different regions and domestic output. And domestic output itself is composed of commodities and value added. So we bring in here information on prices and quantities of imports and commodities in our production side. And since 2020, our model also features an energy component, so which is the same in our model for simplicity as the commodity component. The final consumption has a direct energy component. So there's a direct effect of, say, oil prices on the price of consumption in the model, on top of what is already included in the production side. But we distinguish the world market price and the retail price of commodities in the model. There's some sluggish adjustment. And what is new also is that we have a commodity extraction in the rest of the world in the US, which is the only difference in structure between the US and the euro area. Fiscal blocks are fairly detailed. So we have government spending, government investment. We also have a subsidy to labor hoarding in the model, short-term work schemes, which will be operating only in the euro area, but that's an estimation result. It's not assumed. We have a monetary policy that is subject to an effective lower bound, which we set a bit lower in the euro area because we observe actually negative rates in the euro area, whereas in the US, the rates that we use for our estimation that we made above zero. I should get to this IRF just to not skip your question. So this is a one-time innovation of this shock, and what is different, what I'm showing here is the forced saving shock in blue, and I compare this to a standard discount factor shock. I think the most striking one is private consumption. We have a 1 quarter drop in private consumption, which then bounces back and actually overshoots a bit due to this excess saving. It's also interesting is that despite a very large movement in private consumption, there's actually relatively little movement of inflation. And that's because it's a one-off shock, so it doesn't really enter this New Keynesian Philipp curve type of mechanism.
Good, like 7 minutes.
Okay, then I should speed up. Just in terms of methodology, it's kind of related to the point that you raised. We estimate the model. In this version, we estimate until 2019 Q4 the main parameters of the model, so the structural behavioral parameters, but we estimate the pandemic-specific shocks separately on top of that. And basic assumption is that agents in our model, so there's a deterministic heteroscedasticity, and we exploit it. We actually know when the pandemic happened. So it sounds very simple, but we don't really need a Markov switching model or something to identify the regime, right? We know exactly when it happened. On top of that, I think we can argue that it came to most people, at least as a very strong surprise. So people didn't really have that in their decision rule. That's why we can cut a corner here and assume that there's a deterministic version of heteroscedasticity, which is actually quite close to the VAR framework of Lensam and the cherry. In terms of shock identification, we also account for the effective lower bound for the parameter estimation. That's work in progress to extend of that. Couple stylized facts that the model seems to get right. So we impose identical priors. If I were a Bayesian, a true Bayesian, I would also try to bring in more micro data on, say, price adjustment frequencies, differences between the countries, but we want to only let the macro data speak. So we have identical price. We find that there are higher real rigidities in the euro area, consistent with some empirical evidence on wages and investment. We actually have a flat Phillips curve in both regions. And in line with the observed adjustment, we also have a much stronger adjustment along the extensive margin in the US. Okay, let's get to the meat. So here's the historical shock decomposition, which shocks are driving GDP growth on a year-on-year basis according to our model. So these candy boxes can be explained as follows. So you have in black the year-on-year observed data of GDP growth in the two regions. And then you have different shocks groups that are explaining the observed time series according to our model. And by construction, the sum of these contributions must sum up to the true data. So what do we see here? So we see quite some similarities. So a strong lockdown or consumption-driven recession initially in 2020 Q2, which then in the US led to a demand-driven recovery, also fueled by fiscal shocks. Compared to that, the euro area, where bouncing back was actually weaker in the first place, and then it was mostly driven according to the model by relaxations of these lockdown indicators. What we're also doing in our papers, we are comparing the estimated shocks to indicators, say stringency indicator, there's an Oxford stringency indicator and real mobility indicator, and the path of our shock seems to be capturing quite well the dynamics here early on. Then the euro area being more open, there's a much stronger influence from foreign shocks in the overall GDP dynamics compared to the US. But overall, they're broadly similar. But this will not be the case for the inflation dynamics, where I will go next to. Yeah, I summed it up, but let's jump in the interest of time directly to inflation. So here I do the same exercise using the consumption deflator growth as the measure of inflation. And again, year on year. For the US, we first of all find a strong role of fiscal policy, transfer shocks notably, that increased inflation according to the model, and a stronger role for demand. Relatively little supply-driven inflation initially, at least. And on top of that, the dollar appreciation, which is partially captured by a shock here, also brought down inflation. And the overall commodity price component in the 2022 part of inflation is smaller than the euro area, which is consistent with the greater exposure of the euro area to gas prices, for example. So now going to the euro area, we have more supply shocks. Partially, they reflect also that given the strong decline of activity, the model would actually predict a stronger deflationary pressure here, while we have some offsetting shocks that stabilize in inflation here, so that the inflation response was initially quite muted. But then the pickup was basically, according to the model, a reversal of the domestic demand fallout, plus the reversal of foreign activity, which brought up prices as well, and then most notably commodity prices here. And on top of that, we have a depreciation, which further increased the inflation in the euro area according to this model. 2 minutes. Okay. Then I'm right on time to wrap up. Yeah, so we estimated a three-region model to jointly evaluate different drivers of growth and inflation. We introduced this very stylized forced savings shock that's, first of all, helps us to keep on using this kind of model, without distorting too much the interpretation of, say, shock decompositions. And the inflation surge in 21-22 was mainly driven by recovering demand and rising commodity prices, and we had a stronger influence of supply side factors in the euro area compared to the US. So here we adopted a standard comprehensive model. It has a bunch of channels, but maybe those parts that were larger than others warrant a deeper understanding using a more specific model. I think there are great contributions at this conference that look, for example, into nonlinear Phillips curves, or maybe how supply shocks can be more inflationary in certain environments. And so we see this sort of as speaking to a larger literature that focuses then more on specific channels. Thank you.
Contagion, infections, people dying and the likes. So it was a pleasure, Takeup. And actually, what I enjoyed is that it displays the skills that you guys need to have in a central bank, that you need to be clever to use what you already have in place to give answers or give guidance to the policymakers. So that's what I enjoy about this paper, and I'll be more precise about this comment. Okay, so in one slide, this paper is trying to understand the impact of the COVID shock in the US and the European area. To this end, Philipp and co-authors built a very rich region model. So there are a lot of bells and whistles that in a central bank, that's what we want to see. Then the main takeaway of what I got from this paper are two things. The first one is that this forced savings shock is critical to match the contraction of consumption in the two regions. Okay. As a bonus, and as the second result in the paper, is that they can talk about the dynamics of inflation in the last 2 years or so. And the conclusion, sorry. The conclusion is that the US inflation is mainly driven by demand, either domestic demand or the government trying to pop up the economy, whereas in the European area, this is driven mostly by commodity prices and by supply shocks. Okay. It's a very nice executed paper. I don't understand why Philipp kept sending me this email saying, oh, this is a work in progress, when in fact the paper is practically done. The comments I'm going to make is probably one is more on the inside of the paper. The other one is probably a follow-up paper that you might write. Yeah, so let me go to the comments. So the first one is born out of this picture. So I don't have to convince you much enough that if you look back at 2000, US and Europe started in the same path. But by 2020, those economies are completely different. Okay? I don't need to force you to believe me. We are moving in different paths. There used to be a common trend, but you can see that, especially in private consumption and private investment, these are two different economies. Okay? So with this figure in mind, and this is the data that Philipp is using, then my first comment is why do you impose a symmetry? I kind of see from, if I'm an academic, I see that point because it allows me to understand how big the COVID shock, or in this case, the forced saving shock, has to be to account for the dynamics of the economy. But if you're advising a policymaker, then maybe preserving the symmetry between the two countries, this is biasing the size of the shock and may result in misguided policy making. Okay? So, if I were to attack this question, having the luxury of time and tenure at Boston College, then I'll start with a model that captures the asymmetries. In particular, one can ask what type of asymmetry I would put emphasis is the labor market difference. That's like if I think where I'm different or where the US is different from our European friends, is that labor market are different. And in this sense, you can see that in the US, because the social network is not, the social net, the safety net is not as generous, then the incentives to go back to work in the US were huge. Okay, so that's one difference. Related, I'll start with a search and matching model. Okay, so that's the way to go. Why? Because as I was reading this paper, it reminded me of this agenda, not only by Sargent, but also Prescott in the 2000s, trying to understand why employment dynamics were different in the US and the Europe area. And what this paper by Lundquist and Sargent emphasizes is that the divergence in the labor market outcomes in between US and Europe started in the 1980s. And the reason that gets out of this paper is a very nice quantitative paper, is that the cost of hiring and firing people, plus the more generous unemployment compensation in Europe is the main difference why we see these very persistent unemployment rates in Europe. Okay. Given that there is the employment component was a big part of the COVID shock, I thought was an important element of the discussion of what packages should be delivered to support the economy. I think moving forward or trying to revisit from a historical perspective what your model said versus what a more realistic labor market model might say, this is one I would go. And this is my comment. Maybe this is another paper you want to write, because there is a lot to be said in this framework. Okay. So let me go to the second comment. And this I'm going to get a bit on the technical side here. So what is a forced saving shock? So here you have this shock enters the utility function in two places. So contemporaneously enters here, and then with a lag from the previous period. You don't need to be a genius to immediately realize that what this shock is going to do is distort the marginal utility of consumption in the way that you need to reduce the incentives to consume and to save. So this is where I said this is very clever. So this is like you see that you have a group of very smart people that think very carefully what to do without going through this other class of models where you have the contagion and these things to get something that the policymaker can understand. Yet at the same time, then we start getting into these dicey areas. Why? Because if this shock is too big, then this utility function might be not defined, even a complex value. You don't detect that because you linearize the model. So you are not checking the bounds. So here, and that's why I asked you the time series for these shocks. They don't look big enough to create this problem, but that's something that is worth checking, because if you get a utility function that is not defined, then the entire process, at least from a policy making normative perspective, is completely useless. A bit on the same respect, the fact that there was the COVID shock is true that was unexpected, but moving forward, there was a lot of rational decisions that people were making, right? Because then that's what we get out of these serial models, that we see if I go out, I get contagious, and then my family. So there is an economic effect that this guy is missing. So in this sense, this approach is subject to the Lucas critique. And again, that's a trade-off that I totally understand, because those are like central bankers, you have to call those shocks, but that's something that one has to be aware once we want to think more deeply about what are the implications of this shock. Okay. Now, to conclude my discussion, I was also writing a COVID paper, and obviously we were not as smart and fast as other people, so we got discouraged of writing the COVID paper. But actually, we came to a very interesting conclusion that is related to Philipp's paper. So Philipp is looking in one direction of the problem, is looking at the COVID shock into the economy. Okay. But in this project that we're working with Thorsten and my former student, Alexei Kazanov, we look at the other direction, that at least I was not aware that actually macro shocks have individual health outcomes, okay? To the point that we are playing with this title for the paper, is the Fed a bata for your health? Why? I'm not gonna go into the details, we can talk later if you want, but we collected data from different surveys of self-reported health. So people are asking, how are you feeling today in a scale of 1 to 5? 5 is great, 1 is I'm terrible. And what we did is, so you can collect a time series that goes back to the 1970s. We compute the average across many individuals there. And what you have here is the input response of this average index of how well people are doing in the economy. And what it's telling you is that when there is a tightening of 1 percentage point of the Fed funds rate in the US, initially there is not much response. You see people are still saying, I'm getting a bit sick, but it's not statistically significant. About 2 years after that, this number is telling you that 2% of workers in the US are telling you that they are not feeling well. Okay. So that was something, and this is a very robust result. We tried with other measures that are more objective, equally other measures that are other surveys, but this is something that keeps coming, that there is a cyclicality of these health outcomes that are connected to one monetary policy. We also connected to fiscal policy. Okay. And as a quick comment, there is another, this problem has two phases, the extensive margin, you think I die or I live, versus the intensive margin, how well I am doing. And it's the opposite. Once you think the extensive margin, recessions are good for your health, actually. It's because people don't drive, you don't get killing accidents. Yeah. Putting these two things together took us almost 2 years because it was driving us nuts that the extensive versus the intensive.
Thank you, organizers, for including our in the program. Today, I will talk to you about labor market effects of global supply chain disruptions. This is joint work with Jose Pablo Vasquez, who's at LSE, and Roman Zarate, who's at the World Bank. And the usual disclaimer applies for the SFL or the World Bank. Okay, so let me motivate this paper a little bit. We all know that the pandemic had a number of important consequences on global supply chains. It caused a number of disruptions. This could be due to ports being closed in China, in California, and different parts of the world, as well as reduced shipping capacity due to lockdowns that persisted for longer than we expected initially in China, other parts of the world as well, or fewer shipping workers being available, perhaps due to health reasons, early retirement, whatever. So that could have an important impact on the costs of moving goods across countries, maybe within countries as well, but in this paper, we're going to focus on the effects of international trade that this could have induced, increasing those costs. And since then, there has been a huge interest in analyzing the economic effects of these disruptions. For example, how do they affect labor markets across and within countries? How do they affect sectoral composition between tradables and non-tradables, so between manufacturing, services, and agriculture, etc.? And ultimately, how does it affect wealth? So we're going to analyze these questions at a global level. First, we're going to focus on the US economy, but then we're going to turn to the effects on other countries. But the focus is going to be from the perspective of a trade model instead of like a open economy macro model. So there will be kind of no Euler equation, no DSG, more kind of like dynamic quantitative spatial models, like in Caliendo, Amparo, and those sort of papers. Okay, so we're going to examine these labor market consequences. We're going to model this disruption as an increase in the costs of sending goods across countries that is going to be of 12%, and it's going to last for 3 years. But I'm going to show you some robustness on what happens if the shock is bigger, smaller, lasts for more years or less years, etc. And we're going to use several data sources, the OECD's inter-country input-output database, commodity flow survey for the US, etc., in order to match the economy in 2019, how trade flows are happening between countries, how people are moving between sectors, how value added is being generated in the model. So that's going to be matched with data in the real world. Then we're going to hit the economy with a shock. It's going to last for 3 years, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And then in 2023, the cost of international trade is going to revert to the level that it had in 2019. And then we're going to use the dynamic quantitative trade model to analyze this shock. It has several important features. There are forward-looking agents, as in the paper by Artur, Choudhury, and McLaren, who move regions and potentially sectors and potentially regions with perfect foresight of what's going to happen in the economy going forward, and cost of migration that are going to be implicitly calibrated to match the data in 2019. There's going to be home production, as in Caliendo, Orqui, and Parma, and this is going to give us an upward sloping supply curve for labor. And there's going to be unemployment from downward nominal wage rigidity, which is going to be, as in Grohe and Uribe 2016 paper, and incorporated into a multi-sector dynamic trade model, as in a paper that I have with Deborah Lucas and Jose Pablo Vasquez. And then we're going to solve this model using dynamic cycle algebra once the shock hits going forward into the far future. Okay, as a preview of our findings, that impact of the shock is going to vary by sector. In the US on aggregate, there's going to be a fall in labor force participation, but instead there's going to be an increase in manufacturing employment because the US is a net importer of manufacturing, so it needs to substitute some of the manufacturing that it was getting from other countries. Now that this becomes more expensive, it's starting to be produced at home. Once the shock dissipates, then that returns to where it was before, and instead there's a decline in employment in services and agriculture. And then the states that have a larger service sector, like Alaska, Hawaii, Nevada, Louisiana, etc., are going to suffer a larger fall in labor force participation. And states that do more manufacturing, like Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and states like that, are going to see smaller fall in labor force participation. And internationally, the impact of the shock and the effect on labor force participation is going to depend on how open or big these countries are. Big countries like China, the US, Brazil, India are going to experience a smaller decline in labor force participation, whereas small open economies like Ireland, Estonia, and Slovakia are going to see a larger decline. And we're also going to kind of find that more monetary accommodation can mitigate the unemployment effects of this shock that are going to happen actually when the shock disappears instead of when the shock first materializes. And I'm going to come back to this and the definition for that later on. So I'm going to skip the literature in the interest of time, and let me get back to the model. We're going to have a model with many regions. They're going to be I regions. This is going to be 87. M of them are going to be inside of the US. Those are going to be the 50 US states. And then we're going to have S market sectors. That's going to be 14, 12 in manufacturing, 1 in services, 1 in agriculture. And then we're going to also have a home production sector. And then within region I, there's going to be Cobb-Douglas preferences across market sectors with these shares alpha IS. And then we're going to have an Hamilton assumption within sectors with elasticity of substitution sigma S, so that the goods of all the regions in a given sector are aggregated using this Hamilton aggregator with this elasticity. And all income is going to be devoted to consumption here, so there's no Euler equation, kind of as more typical in these trade models compared to open economy macro models. And then production is going to be perfect competition, Cobb-Douglas, with a labor share that varies by region and sector. This is going to be this phi IS, and then intermediate input shares phi IKS. That means that sector S needs this given share from sector K to produce in region I. And then there's iceberg trade cost tau IJST of sending goods from region I to region J in sector S at time T. And these are the ones that we're going to shock when the global supply chain disruption hits. These are going to increase 12% for 3 years if I and J are regions that are in different countries. If they're in the same countries, then this is not going to be shocked. Even though in COVID, like the cost of sending goods within the US also kind of changed, but we're going to focus on the international component. And then with this setup, the price in region I at time T is just the aggregate of the sectoral prices with a given Cobb-Douglas shares. Then the price within a given sector is the usual Hamilton aggregator, where we aggregate the goods of the different origins that can send into region J with the elasticity of substitution, sigma. And then the price of sending the good of region I to region J in sector K at time T depends on this iceberg trade cost of sending goods, the productivity in the sender region sector, the wage in the sender region sector, and then the sectoral prices because they're used as intermediate inputs with these intermediate input shares. Okay, we're also going to have exogenous trade imbalances, D, which we're going to use to match the data in 2019. So we're going to allow those to vary as they do in the data. They're going to remain constant once the shock hits. So they're not endogenous. We could shock them in different ways, but still kind of in an exogenous framework, but we haven't done that yet. And then equilibrium in region I sector S at time T would tell us that the revenues in that region sector have to equal demand, and demand is coming from all the regions in the world with given trade shares, which are this lambda IJST, have a traditional expression, and then this demand is coming from two parts, from final good consumption, which is total expenditure in the region that's demanding that with the given Cobb-Douglas shares, but you also use some for intermediate inputs. So we have the revenue in all those sectors times this intermediate input shares. And then labor market clearing would say that what's paid to labor, which is the wage times the number of people employed, has to equal the revenue in that region sector times this labor share. And then if we were in a standard model, we would close this by saying that there is kind of pre-mobility within sectors in a region and exogenous labor supply. So the total amount of labor employed in a given region and sector would have to equal that exogenous labor to in that region, kind of to all sectors. But instead, we're going to have something more complicated, and the labor supply decisions are going to be dynamic, subject to some mobility costs, as in Caliendo, Orqui, Amparo, and ACM. And agents are going to be able to move in the baseline model only across sectors. There would be no mobility across US states, but in one of the extensions, we have mobility across US states. That doesn't turn out to make a huge difference. In the paper that we have at the China shock, it makes a little bit more of a difference. So we can turn it on and off. And in other countries, they can only move across sectors because for us, the other countries only have one region. We don't have the regions of different regions in the other countries. We only have that for the US with the 50 US states. And then these agents are going to be forward-looking. So they're going to make these decisions with perfect foresight, and they're going to move across these sectors and potentially across these regions, subject to relocation costs that are going to be inferred by the model in 2019 in order to match all these flows as they're occurring in the data. And then in region I at time T, home production in a given region I is going to yield this kind of exogenous utility, UI, that is not going to be affected by the kind of labor market conditions. But then participating in sector S in region I is going to yield this omega that I'm going to come back to later. And then we're going to have these different elasticities of moving across sectors and regions, and Gondol amenity shock to participating in a given region sector that is going to deliver nice expressions for the amount of people that move between different regions and sectors, which are these ones over here. And those are going to depend on the expected utility of participating in a given region sector and the mobility cost, which are these kind of bar pies with these elasticities, 1 over nu and 1 over kappa that can potentially be different. In Caliendo, Orqui, and Amparo, these two elasticities are the same, but we allow them to be different. And then in Caliendo, Orqui, and Amparo, this utility of participating in a given region sector would just be your real wage. But now I'm going to talk about the downward nominal wage rigidity. This is going to introduce the possibility of unemployment. And then we have to adjust this real wage for the fact that people might be unemployed. So we're going to multiply the real wage by this ratio, which is the amount of people that are actually employed in the region sector divided by the total number of people that are supplying their labor to that region sector. So, sorry.
No, just you got 9 minutes. You're going really fast. We'll go.
Okay, but I have a lot of stuff to say. So, so this is like 0.95. Yeah, that means unemployment in that sector is 5% in that region sector. So you're only going to get like 5% of the real wage. And here we're assuming that there is kind of perfect risk sharing in this region sector, which is, I mean, it's a kind of an heroic assumption. If we had instead people that are actually unemployed and people that are fully employed, then the cost of this kind of unemployment would be greater. So this would be given kind of more like a lower bound. But otherwise, solving the model would be very hard. This way we can solve the model, and it's still really complicated to solve. And this block will determine labor supply to each region sector, discursive LISD. Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit more about this downward nominal wage rigidity. This will say that the wage in local currency units in a region I and sector S has to be greater or equal than that same wage in the previous period times some downward nominal wage rigidity parameter delta. And there's two important things that I should point out here. The first is that this is a nominal thing. So this wage is in local currency units. And so far, we have been writing a bunch of wages kind of everywhere. And those were nominal wages, and those were all in dollars. But now we're writing something in local currency units. So later, we're going to need to turn them into dollars using some exchange rates. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. And the second thing is that this delta in principle, could vary across regions, across time, and across sectors. In order to have a parsimonious model, we're going to assume that they don't vary by region, except for the exchange rate that I'm going to come back to, and that they don't vary across time, but they could vary by sector. In the baseline, they're going to be the same across all sectors, but in an extension, we could apply them only to manufacturing because there may be more unionization in manufacturing or kind of more rigid wages. And then in a China chalk paper, that's one of the important things. Kind of the model works better when we have this delta only in manufacturing. Okay, and then besides this downward nominal wage rigidity, we have maximum employment, saying that the total amount of people employed has to be smaller than the total amount of people giving or supplying their labor to that sector. And then we have a complementary likeness condition saying that one of these two has to bind with equality. So there can only be unemployment if the wage is at its lower bound. And then, as I said, this is in local currency units. So let me turn it into something in dollars using an exchange rate of the local currency unit to dollars. And then we're not going to kind of consider this endogenous, but instead we can do two things with these exchange rates. We could say that the countries that are not the US have flexibility in managing this so that this kind of inequality never binds, so that they never have any unemployment. Or we could say that they have fixed exchange rates so that this ratio is always 1, and then this would take the same form in other countries as it does in the US. So in our baseline, we assume that they have flexibility, so other countries never see any unemployment, but in an extension, we did kind of fixed exchange rates. So those are the two kind of polar opposites, and you can imagine somewhere in between where they have some flexibility, but not perfect, but that would just be like a combination of the two cases. And then since we introduced nominal elements, namely this downward nominal wage rigidity, we also need to assume a nominal anchor. This is something that prevents wages in every region in the world growing kind of fast enough in order to make the downward nominal wage rigidity always not binding. So what we're going to assume is that world nominal GDP in dollars grows at a rate of gamma. So this is world nominal GDP in dollars, and it just increases by gamma every period. This is obviously a simplification relative to assuming a Taylor rule in every country, but it's going to allow us to solve this otherwise very complicated model using an efficient Alvarez and Lucas contraction mapping algorithm that we developed to deal with this downward nominal wage rigidity. In the China chalk paper, using kind of this model, we talk more about why this is a kind of good representation of some aspects of the world, but for now, let me move on. And I will show you a robustness of assuming these different levels for this gamma.
For 4 minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to skip the data in the interest of time, but we combine a bunch of stuff. And then, as I said, we're going to do a shock of 12% for 3 years. This is kind of loosely based on the increase in this producer price index for deep sea freight transportation services. But I'm going to show you what happens if it's different, if it persists for different amounts instead of 3 years. And the nominal growth rate in my baseline is going to be 4%. Kind of a loose idea of nominal growth rate in the world since the pandemic hit, but I'm going to show you what happens if instead it's 2, 3, 5, or 6%. The inverse elasticity of moving across sectors I'm going to take from the China chalk paper, trade elasticity just from the trade literature. Okay, so let me get to some results. This is what happens at the aggregate level for the US for unemployment, which is in red, employment, labor force participation, which is in green, and then employment, which is in blue, is kind of just a combination of these two. So this is 2019, then the shock hits in 2020, 2021, and 2022, and then it reverts, it disappears in 2023 already, and we can see that labor starts reverting. So why do people flow out of the labor force when the shock hits? Getting goods from other countries is more expensive. Those goods are used as intermediate inputs when you produce, so it's less productive to work in the labor market as opposed to doing home production because the return to that doesn't change with the supply chain disruptions. So people move into the home production and out of the labor force. And then unemployment is generated mostly when the shock dissipates instead of when it appears. And the intuition for that is a little convoluted, but we think it makes sense. And it has to do with this world nominal anchor. At the beginning, when the shock is hitting, people are flowing out of the labor force. So kind of the monetary authorities of the world have to manage an increase in W so that this thing is just changing according to this rule, right? L is going down, so they have to increase W. So W is not hitting the downward nominal wage rigidity when that happens. It is when the shock disappears and these people are coming back into the labor force that W has to fall in order kind of to maintain this, and then that is when it hits the downward nominal wage rigidity. And that kind of rings a bell with what's happening. Like you put a lot of stimulus into the economy to prevent like a crash of GDP. And then once people are coming back and you start seeing inflation, you have to withdraw the monetary support, and that's when unemployment kind of generates. Of course, this is not capturing everything perfectly, and this is not an analysis of all of the impacts of COVID. It's just the international supply disruption part. So we're not going to see the unemployment from the fact that people were not working when the pandemic hit. This is just the international supply part. So that's kind of generated mostly when the shock is hit. And then across sectors, this is the fall, the increase in home production, which is the fall in labor force participation. Services and agriculture see the employment fall, but manufacturing actually increases while the shock is active in 2020, 2021, 2022, because you need to produce that in the US because the US is a net importer of manufacturing. But then when the shock dissipates, then people go back out of manufacturing, and actually some unemployment is generated mostly in manufacturing because that's the sector that grew kind of rapidly while the shock was active. This is a map of how things look in the US. I said like some of the states that do more manufacturing kind of suffer less, so that's a lower fall in labor force participation. But Alaska, Hawaii, Nevada that have more services, they see a bigger fall in labor force participation. And then let me tell you briefly about the impact across countries. This is the change in home production between 2019 and 2020. So that will be kind of between here and the peak. So we're just seeing the fall, then it kind of comes back. But there, the fall is a lot bigger for these small open economies like Ireland, Estonia, Slovakia, Cyprus, etc., because they're very exposed to this shock because they compete a lot with other countries in all the markets that they send to, but also they get affected by it from imports. So in all the side imports and exports, they're affected a lot. For big countries like China, Japan, the US, Brazil, India, etc., we see that the shock is a lot smaller. And we can see how these countries are exposed to this shock using a measure by Laura Polakis and Esposito that I don't have time to kind of get into, but it's kind of seeing how you compete with other countries in imports, exports, etc., how exposed you are. And we see that these kind of small open economies are very exposed and they see a big fall in labor force participation, where these big economies are less exposed and they don't see a bigger fall. But then what happens across sectors, for example, in manufacturing, depends not only on the overall fall in labor force participation, which is certainly a factor, but also on whether you're a net importer or exporter of manufacturing. Countries like Great Britain, the US, or Russia that are net importers of manufacturing, they actually see an increase in their manufacturing employment because they have to substitute things that they were getting from other places in the world. But then some countries over here, either that see a bigger fall in labor force participation or that are net exporters of manufacturing, they suffer loss, greater loss. These are the welfare losses. They look very similar to the LFP losses, but obviously the level is different. So this is kind of from just when the shock hits, we get the consumption equivalent variation, and it's around almost 1% for Ireland. But for the US, China, Japan, it's a lot lower, like 14 basis points, something like that. Okay, so I ran out of time, but I could tell you how the results change with the persistence of the shock, the size of the shock, or this kind of growth in the nominal GDP of the world. I'm just gonna leave it there.
Yeah. So thanks a ton for inviting me out here and for having me discuss the paper. I just moved away from New York like a month ago, so I really missed the subway, so I really appreciated that. Yeah, although my MTA card expired, so they don't want me back. Anyway, so I'm going to discuss this paper. It's beautiful, and I'm not going to do it justice at all. Instead, I'm going to do the tiny brain macro labor economist version of a gigantic trade model with a bunch of bells and whistles, but trying to understand kind of particularly the labor market dynamics. So just to summarize, they're kind of starting with this base of Rodriguez, Claro, Ulate, and Vasquez, which is a multi-sector model with the IO links, super rich. And then these are kind of the two key features driving the labor force, the labor market features, which is this downward nominal wage rigidity and upward sloping labor supply. And so that's going to kind of move around demand and supply curves in ways which are kind of interesting and create a lot of the interesting dynamics that are kind of the notable new features here. And then the main thing that we're going to experiment, or that they experiment with, is this 12% iceberg trade shock that reverts after 3 years. Okay, so then specifically, like kind of the really cute bells and whistles is, so I'm going to say this both to say that it's pretty state of the art, and also this is going to play a role in how labor markets move. So there's this exact hat algebra, which if you're not part of it, it's really kind of backwards engineering Gumbel shocks in order to fit exactly the trade and reallocation patterns of people. So we have these Gumbel shocks, which are essentially saying I have additive random utility on top of my dynamic choice value functions, and then you can shift around the mean of these value functions to get what you want. So that's coming out of exact hat algebra, and that gives them an exceptionally nice tight fit on a very rich set of data. And then on the other side, there's this wage rigidity and then labor demand and supply form a system to determine employment. And I'll talk about this more. But so our wage rigidity says that wages are bounded below by some multiple of last period's wages. And then on the flip side, unemployment is going to be the difference between supply of labor, script L, and demand for labor, capital L. Right? And so these need not equate because of downward wage rigidity. So labor supply script L is going to be determined by, in particular, this Gumbel shock, which was part and parcel to the exact hat algebra that got us everywhere, right? There's kind of Gumbel shocks flying around all over the place. And then Gumbel shock on top of the value of home production relative to the value of work. So when the value of work changes, wages and whatnot moves around, that is going to be relative to the value of staying home and I don't know what it is that people do at home, but staying home, coupled with the Gumbel shock. And then labor demand is going to be determined by the MPL and this downward wage rigidity. Okay, good. So driving the labor dynamics again, this to me at least was like the main picture, right? So the labor supply shifts towards home production when this iceberg shock comes in. And that's because the trade shock makes employment less productive, right? The iceberg shock basically makes working worse because we're less productive, less efficient in creating stuff when an iceberg shock kind of drives a wedge between the ability to get goods from A to B. So that's going to drive down labor supply, the green line. But then in the aftermath of the shock evaporating, wages are downward rigid. And so labor demand goes down by even more. And so then this gap here becomes unemployment. And that shows up right here in unemployment. So first we have the labor supply decline. And so you can't hire them if they don't want to work because we're just less productive because of the iceberg shock. And then the persistence of this comes from wage rigidity. Okay, so now that to me at least, I'm probably totally. This is how I read the mechanisms. So then I kind of thought that there were kind of two big things to think about. So first was the Gumbel shocks and the exact hat algebra. Like I said, they're kind of flying around all over the place. And so one of the big questions is, first of all, sorry, this should be psi, not phi. Your notation is not friendly for typing in LaTeX. I'm impressed you can do it. So how much variation is in the psi shocks, which are kind of the mean shifters in this exact hat algebra, and kind of when thinking about like how much is happening by the direct model mechanisms versus these kind of utility shifters, I at least think that's kind of a nice just to tell the reader how much is happening endogenously versus what is essentially exogenous shifts. And from my own work with these in kind of regional models of labor markets, you can get a lot happening just at the baseline because of the psi parameters have a lot of dispersion in them. And to be honest, I never really know how to think about that. But then kind of in the favor of the authors, so they say, you know, we're fixing these Gumbel shock shifter mobility parameters, and so maybe you should worry about that. Maybe having these psi's fixed is a problem because post-COVID was different than pre-COVID in some fundamental way about mobility between home and sectors. And so actually, some work that I did with Fabian Longa, Lisa Kahn, and Liza Forsyth, we looked at labor mobility cross sectors and cross occupations before and after the COVID recession. So this is kind of our measure of mobility, and actually what you observe is like really big changes in the crisis, right? Which would be consistent with just big shocks and constant size. But then actually, like shortly after, mobility basically reverts to pre-pandemic levels, less so in occupation, but certainly in terms of industry. So I think that's an argument to not be as concerned as the authors might have been about fixing these psi parameters. That like, if you want to think of them as structural and not changing across the COVID cycle, well, you know, in some ways, patterns of reallocation kind of reverted to their pre-COVID pattern. Or maybe you leave it in the paper and then a referee sees it and is like, I got them, and then you can say, no, it's always good. Okay, and then the final point that I wanted to make is that this is a paper where downward nominal wage rigidity plays a huge role. It drives unemployment and it drives the persistence of unemployment in particular. So it's cool, it's interesting, and you know, there's a lot of great evidence that downward nominal wage rigidity is an important feature of the way that economies adjust. But how to interpret downward nominal wage rigidity in the data, I think, is a bit treacherous, particularly in the post-COVID era, because wage growth was so high, right? And so in periods when wages are growing a lot, when does it bind and for whom, I think is a non-trivial question. And so that's just, you know, because I'm now a company man, I work for the Fed, I guess, and we have this product called the wage growth tracker. I thought I would use it to illustrate a simple point, which is they cross a lot of occupations. So here's occupations divided by skill, cross a lot of industries. In all of these, wages are growing quite a bit. And so the set of firms that would like to cut wages but can't and therefore don't employ people, you know, one might have to look rather hard for them. Yeah, good, good. So sorry to connect that. So one might have to look rather hard for the firms that would like to cut wages but can't, because it seems like most firms are growing wages. And so then thinking about the mechanism by which unemployment was generated in the model, you know, maybe one has to think hard about what's the source of heterogeneity or whatever that's doing that. Okay, awesome. So 6 slides, 6.
Okay, I totally misunderstood. No, thanks. That was a great discussion. So it's super helpful. Okay, so the variation in the kind of cost of moving. Yeah, so the Gumbel shocks are not really getting us. There's not actually variation in the kind of the distribution where those Gumbel shocks are coming.